Hi, thanks for joining me. I'm Larry Taylor. We're studying the Sermon on the Mount, and we're in chapter 7. Most commentators put chapter 7, verses 15 through 20 together. I had to lean over and look at my Bible um, because they both have a reference to the bearing of good fruit. Um, but there's two different contrasts here. In Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 13, running through the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives us five different contrasts. Five different things are contrasted by the Lord in verses 13 through the end of the Sermon on the Mount. The first contrast we saw last time is a contrast between two different roads. One is the normal everyday life that leaves God out. The other is the difficult road of truly being a disciple of Jesus, really truly following him, doing what he says to do, living by the Sermon on the Mount. But it leads to flourishing, abundant, joyous life. The second contrast, the one we'll look at right now, is between sheep and wolves that look like sheep. And the third contrast, and a lot of commentators link these together, again because of the reference to fruit, is between healthy trees and unhealthy trees. So in verse 15, Jesus says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits." And then he goes on shifting the metaphor to talk about fruit vines and fruit trees. Beware of false prophets. False prophets, of course, have always plagued the people of God. We see it in the Old Testament. We see it in the New Testament. We see it in Paul's writings as he traveled around proclaiming the gospel. Here we need to be cautious that we don't fall into the trap of being judgmental, which, remember, in chapter 7, verse 1 and following, Jesus was very strongly warning us that we have no right to judge other people, that we are to love the way God loves, but never try to judge in the same way that God judges, because we don't have the ability to do that, and it's dangerous for us to try. We are not able to discern the inner motives, the genetic makeup, the early childhood influences, the societal influences, all the different things that go into causing a person to be who they are and do what they do. So I have no right to be judgmental. However, I do need to be discerning, particularly when it comes to false prophets. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm judging them. It doesn't mean that I'm condemning them. It doesn't mean that I'm saying that person is a false prophet and he or she is not a Christian and he or she is going to go to hell or anything like that. That's strictly God's business. But I am to be discerning about what it is that prophet is proclaiming. Now, what do we mean by a prophet? I think oftentimes we think that a prophet is someone who predicts the future. That's, in a biblical sense, only a very, very narrow part of a prophet's ministry. Certainly, we do hear predictions For example, the Messianic prophecies. There's well over 300 of them in the Old Testament. Virtually all the prophets of the Old Testament, in one way or another, predict the coming of the Messiah. And Jesus fulfills all of those, which, when you stop and think about it, is quite remarkable. So there is a sense in which a prophet is someone who, to whom God shows something about the future. But that's maybe 1%. I just made that up. Maybe 1% of a prophet's ministry. Biblically, the prophet is the one who speaks truth to power. The prophet is the one who speaks on behalf of God, particularly, and we see this especially in the Old Testament. One of the major themes of the prophets is social justice, justice in society, treating widows and orphans with care and respect rather than foreclosing on their homes and throwing them out in the streets. Treating the stranger, welcoming the stranger as a friend and as a sister or a brother. Being willing to let go of debts and so forth and so on. The Old Testament is filled with prophets who speak truth to power, who speak prophetically. A prophetic sermon, as opposed to an expository sermon, is a sermon in which situations in people's lives or in society are directly addressed using biblical principles. So, for instance, most of us here in North America are familiar with some of the sermons that Martin Luther King Jr. preached. He was very definitely a prophet. He was someone who spoke truth to power, who spoke prophetically about the injustices of war, who spoke prophetically about the injustices of racism, who spoke prophetically on behalf of the poor, the marginalized, the disenfranchised. So, a prophetic ministry is a ministry like that. It's not just predicting the future. Jesus says, beware of false prophets. He says that false prophets look like sheep, but they are really wolves in sheep's clothing. Now, of course, you know the wolf is the predator of the sheep. The wolf will destroy the sheep. The wolf will kill the sheep. The wolf will wreak havoc within the flock. I've seen a pack of wild dogs kill a whole flock of several hundred sheep in a single night. They're not just killing to eat, they're killing to kill. Bloody, strewn carcasses everywhere. Coyotes, predators. Wolves, predators. And in Jesus' illustration, here's a wolf that looks like a sheep. A wolf speaks sheep. The wolf acts like a sheep outwardly. The wolf pretends to be one of the flock. The wolf pretends to be one of God's people. The wolf uses Christian terminology. The wolf uses biblical texts. But the wolf who looks like a sheep is still a wolf. This is a false prophet. So how do you recognize a false prophet? Well, Jesus says you'll know them by their fruits. Sometimes you can recognize a false prophet simply by their lifestyle. If they are living an extravagant lifestyle, if they live in a multi-million-dollar mansion, if they fly around on a private jet, if they only stay in the finest of five-star resorts and wear only the most expensive of clothing, it's a good indication that you're dealing with a false prophet. I would be very, very cautious about someone whose lifestyle is diametrically opposite of the lifestyle that Jesus lived. Jesus was homeless. Jesus owned nothing. The people who followed Jesus gave up everything to follow him. They, if anything, they were not materialistic. They weren't interested in amassing goods just for themselves. They did not see material goods as being indications of God's blessing. On the contrary, they saw too much wealth as being a curse. And so when early Christians gathered together in communities, they collected all the wealth. Everybody gave everything, put it into a common pot, and then they carefully appointed godly people to watch over the pot and to distribute according to need, so that there was no want, and so that everyone had what they needed, but no one had excessive while someone else was living in want. So that's an indication that you may be dealing with a false prophet. Secondly, if the prophet, if the preacher, although maybe quoting biblical texts, but is promoting in any way, even subtly, racism or nationalism under the guise of true patriotism, or is supporting a political agenda which, like the lifestyle, is diametrically opposite of Jesus' agenda, a political agenda that leaves out the poor, the disenfranchised, the broken, the hurting, that promotes violence in terms of war or even social unrest, you're dealing with a false prophet. And historically, of course, we can look back because hindsight has perfect vision, and we hear Adolf Hitler claiming to be a Christian. We see organized churches rallying around Adolf Hitler and supporting him and using biblical texts to support him. We can historically look back and we can find in our own nation here in the United States, we can find presidents who were slave owners and who strongly supported slavery. And we can find that they were strongly supported by churches and denominations and preachers who used biblical texts to support slavery. And later on, some of those same people or their immediate descendants used biblical texts to support segregation, to support discrimination. We can look back in our own history and we can find political leaders who claim to be Christian, who claim to be followers of God, and yet who stole land that native peoples had owned for 10,000 years, and then engaged in genocide to eliminate those native peoples. And when that didn't quite work, drove them off into reservations and segregated them and drove them into poverty. And we can find churches and preachers that supported all that. So it's relatively easy with the vision of hindsight to look back and to say, well, those were false prophets. It's harder when it's right in front of us, when we're in the middle of it, especially if it's the water in which we swim, if it's the culture in which we grew up, if it's what we are most familiar with, then it becomes a little bit harder. But we need to be discerning. We need to ask ourselves, what is this person who's claiming to be a prophet, what is this person really saying? What are the logical conclusions of what this person is saying? If we carry out this preaching, this teaching, to its logical conclusion, where does it lead us? If it leads us into embracing or supporting violence, war, racism, misogyny, homophobia, xenophobia, if it leads us to blame poor people for their own situation, if it leads us to support programs that cut assistance to the elderly or to the handicapped, to the disabled, if it's leading towards the support of policies which are in any way unjust, that are contrary to what Jesus taught, that are contrary to the social justice of the Old Testament prophets, then we are dealing with a false prophet. And there are many of them around today, and they are very vocal, and they are very well known, and some of them have very big ministries, and some of them have a lot of political influence. Jesus says, beware of false prophets. Now, I'm not judging those people. I'm not saying they're not Christian. I'm just saying they're off track. I'm not saying they're going to wind up in hell. I don't believe they are. It's God's business. It's not mine. I'm just saying, beware of following them. Beware of where they are leading you. A true prophet will always lead you into more love. More love for God, more of God's love for you, more love for others, especially the least of his brothers and sisters, the poor, the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the homeless, the mentally ill, the incarcerated, the refugees, and so on. It will lead you into more compassion and more concern for those in need. A true prophet will always lead you into a greater concern for the environment, the beautiful creation that we call nature, that God made and said was good. And in the garden, God appointed the very first people with the task of caring for that garden and stewarding over it. A true prophet will always lead you into greater care for creation, greater care for the animal world, for the world of plants and animals and fish and seaweeds and whales and such. A true prophet will always lead you into greater concern for clean air and clean water, will always lead you into greater concern for those who are victims of racism or xenophobia or that sort of thing. Will always lead you into greater compassion for those who are sick or frail or infirmed or mentally ill or addicted or in any way struggling like that. A true prophet always leads you into greater love for God, a deeper, fuller, richer relationship with God, a deeper, fuller, richer love relationship, reciprocal relationship between Jesus and myself, a deeper expression of community, the community of faith, doing life together. A true prophet will always lead you into joining with God in caring for others, being with God, learning from God to be like God. A true prophet will always lead you into joining God as God makes all things new. A true prophet will stir your heart in the direction of social justice. A true prophet will stir your heart with compassion for those in need. A true prophet will stir your heart with care for creation. A true prophet will lead you into cruciform love, love that looks like the cross, love that is forgiving, love that is self-sacrificial, love that is nonviolent. If that prophet is promoting something else, beware. You're very possibly dealing with a wolf in sheep's clothing.